After dinner, Richard, my husband, was in the backyard grilling some more bistec. He had invited a couple of co-workers, and although it was a simple gathering, without much fuss, that night everyone seemed to be a little more relaxed. Maybe a little too relaxed. From where I stood, I could hear their laughter and smell the smoke coming from the grill. I liked that Richard had such a close group of friends. But there was one in particular, the other Richard, who always made me a little uncomfortable. Not in a dangerous way, but it was that kind of feeling like he was watching me in a different way. You know what I mean? I had never crossed the line. But when we were in the same room, there was an energy, a tension between us. That night, after picking up a bit, I decided to go up to our room to take a breather. I wasn't in the mood to continue the endless chats. Nor was I in the mood to hang around the grill with all those men. Plus, I had some work emails to check. So I quietly excused myself and went upstairs looking for some peace in our room. I had barely been there 10 minutes when I heard a soft knock on the door. I turned around a little confused, and there in the frame was Richard. Not my husband, but the other Richard, leaning against it with his typical relaxed smile. He wasn't completely drunk, but you could tell he'd had a few beers, enough to be a little looser and less careful with his actions. "Hi, Jessica," he said softly as he took a step inside before I could say anything. "Do you mind if I come in for a moment?" In that instant, 1,000 things went through my head. Should I throw him out? Go straight downstairs? My heart was beating fast, but I tried to remain calm on the outside. I hadn't done anything wrong yet, but there was something weird about being alone like this. I swallowed saliva, and trying to sound calm, I asked him everything okay, pretending I didn't feel the tension in the air. He smiled and sat on the edge of the bed. My body instantly tensed, and the air between us grew heavier with every second. I wasn't supposed to be here, not like this, not alone. But I didn't want to make a fuss either, especially since he was a friend of my husband's. What would Richard think if he came upstairs and found his best friend sitting on our bed? "I just wanted to see how you were doing," he said, looking at me with an intensity that lasted a little longer than usual. "You seemed a little distant down there, and I thought maybe you needed some company." At that moment, I felt a mixture of emotions, confusion, discomfort, and to be completely honest, a hint of curiosity. What was I really doing here? Was I just trying to be friendly? Or was there more to it? "Thank you, but I'm fine," I replied with a kind but firm tone. I just wanted some reassurance, but it didn't go away. Instead, he leaned back a bit, crossing his arms as he looked at me in a way that wasn't aggressive or overtly flirtatious, but yes, different. My heart began to beat faster. "Jessica, I don't want to make this weird," Richard said, his voice lowered in a way that gave me goosebumps, "but I've always been curious about something about you." I froze. That was the moment. I knew that what I said now could change everything between us. I hadn't said anything really inappropriate yet, but the air was charged like a storm about to blow. I was testing the boundaries, waiting to see how he would react, and I caught up in this delicate dance. I didn't know how to go on without breaking something. "What are you curious about?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, because I honestly didn't want to know the answer. He leaned forward a little, lowering his voice further. "Do you feel there is something between us?" he said. The room was completely silent. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, and my mind was going a mile a minute trying to decide how to respond. Over the years, there had been glances, strange little moments. But this. He had come into my room, sat on my bed, and said that this was something else, something that shouldn't be happening. Richard started, but my voice trembled. I didn't know how to finish the sentence. Should I confront him? Should I confront him? Laugh and pretend it was nothing? Say no, and ask him to leave, before this went any further? Just then the door opened softly. I was startled, my heart jumped into my throat, and there was my husband standing in the doorway. He looked between the two of us with a look of confusion and surprise on his face. It all happened so fast. 1 second I was alone with Richard in this tense and unspoken confrontation, And the next, my husband was standing there with no idea what had just been said, or how close we were to crossing a boundary. Interrupting something he asked in a light but curious tone, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to erupt just below the surface. I looked at Richard, waiting to see how he would react, praying he wouldn't say something that would make the situation worse. For a second I thought maybe he would say something rash that would ruin everything. But instead he just gave me that usual nonchalant smile and shrugged. "Yes," he said, getting up from the edge of the bed. "I just wanted to make sure Jessica was okay. You know how she gets when she disappears?" My husband smiled, not noticing the tension in the room. "You know how Jess is. You always need a little quiet time." He put a hand on my shoulder and gave me a loving squeeze. "But don't take too long here or you're losing all the fun." I smiled at him, grateful at how easily the situation had vanished. "Down in a moment," I said, giving him a quick kiss on the cheek. Richard also felt as if nothing unusual had happened, and headed for the door. "See you downstairs," he said, his tone light. But his eyes lingered on me for a second longer than necessary before disappearing down the hall. I let out my breath without realizing I was holding it. "That was weird," my husband said, breaking the silence. He looked at me with a small wrinkle on his forehead. "What was he doing here?" I shrugged, trying to act like it was normal. "He said he saw me looking a little weird and wanted to make sure I was okay," I replied. "You know, always with his buddy caretaker attitude, period." My husband raised his eyebrows but didn't ask any more. "Yeah, I guess," he mumbled. He stood still for a second and then added, "But don't take too long, okay? We're thinking of playing some cards and you always beat us." I smiled and nodded. "I'll be down in a few minutes," I told him. He gave me a kiss on the top of my head and walked out, closing the door behind him. I was alone. I sat back down on the edge of the bed, my mind spinning a mile a minute. What had just happened? I had handled everything right. I should tell my husband that his best friend Richard had crossed a boundary. But what could I tell him? Technically, nothing happened. Richard neither touched me nor said anything direct, but what his words implied, the look in his eyes, they were there, they couldn't be denied. He had crossed the line into something dangerous, and I didn't know what to do. I sat there for several minutes, replaying that moment over and over in my head. What would have happened if my husband hadn't walked in, just in time? Would I have been able to stop him? Richard would have gone further, and worse. Why did a part of me wonder what would have happened if things had gone differently? I shook that thought out of my head. That wasn't me. I loved my husband. What happened with Richard was just a moment of weakness for both of us, and I wasn't going to let it turn into something more. I took a deep breath, stood up, and straightened my clothes, determined to put that behind me. I would go downstairs with the others as if nothing had happened and everything would go back to normal. But of course, things are never that easy, are they? When I finally went downstairs, the atmosphere had changed. Everything was still relaxed. People were still laughing, but I felt Richard's eyes on me. No matter where I was, he was watching me. In a subtle way, no one else noticed, but I felt it, as if a pressure was hovering over me. We were so close to crossing that line, and he was still there waiting. I did everything I could to avoid it that night. I stayed close to my husband, moving so that there was no chance for us to be alone. I thought I was handling it, that I had the situation under control, but the more I tried to ignore it, the more I felt it. Every time I saw Richard or heard his voice, a knot of anxiety formed in my stomach. What if I tried again? What if next time I wasn't so lucky? A few days later, I found myself alone. I was at home. My husband had gone out to do some things, and I was busy with housework. The doorbell rang. I toweled my hands and went to open the door, expecting a delivery or maybe a neighbor. But when I opened the door, there he was, Richard. I froze, my hand still on the doorknob. "What are you doing here?" I asked. My voice came out more curt than I expected. He smiled, but his eyes showed nothing. "I just wanted to stop by and say hello," he said. I looked around, expecting my husband to show up at any moment. "Richard, now is not a good time," I replied. "Come on, Jessica," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "I think we need to talk." I swallowed my heart ant hard in my chest. "There's nothing to talk about," I replied, trying to keep calm in my voice, but he didn't move. He took a small step forward and lowering his voice, he said, "We all know that night I didn't imagine it, right?" I opened my mouth to protest, but no words came out. My mind was blank. This was exactly what I had, and now it was here on my doorstep with no intention of letting it go. "Richard, you have to go," I said this time with a firmer tone, hoping he would get the hint. For a moment I thought he was going to say something, he was going to insist, but then he sighed, ran his hand through his hair and muttered, "You're right." He took a step back. "I'm sorry." Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there trembling, but also relieved. When I closed the door, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. That unsaid tension would always be there, hiding under the surface. And as much as I wanted to forget it, the truth was that what almost happened between us couldn't be undone. But at least for now, I'd stopped it. And I told myself that that was enough.